tech industry has seen a tremendous amount of change in the past 5 years, and even more so in the last 2. You have so many choices today when it comes to tools, databases, and languages to build apps. To better understand how this abundance affects the developer experience and what it means for the world of databases, I'm delighted to invite Steve O'Grady to the stage. Steve is a co-founder at Redmonk and specializes in the developer world. Steve, welcome.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are as you listen to this. I am Stephen O'Grady. I'm the co-founder of Redmonk. Redmonk, for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, is a developer-focused industry analyst firm, a practitioner-focused industry analyst firm, because we could be here talking to either application developers, maybe you're a DBA, maybe you're a sysadmin operator, who knows. But what we do at Redmonk is we try to understand what practitioners like yourselves are using, why you're using it, and how those trends impact the industry around us. And as a result, we see a lot of things, from a little bit of a different perspective, than those in the industry, because, we're spending most of our time in the trenches, again, trying to understand the trajectories of the technologies that are being used in the market, whether those are up or down, and the trends that impact them. And more specifically, we're here to talk about 2 of them today that are really germane, we think, to hopefully all of you, because they're things that we're hearing about every day. We have developers talking to us about every day. And the vendors who build the tools that many of you use are having these same conversations. So what we're looking at today is the intersection between the developer experience and the database. So to begin, one of the issues is when we talk about the developer experience, it's a term certainly we at Redmonk did not invent. It's been around forever. But it has required a recent currency, and I'll get into sort of maybe why that is, but it's sort of worth defining what we mean by experience. So in this case, the example that I always point to, and the example that I think is sort of maybe most illustrative of what we're talking about, is the original iPhone. So it was introduced in, I believe, January of 2006. And, many of you probably had the same experience that I did walking around. So you're listening to music, a phone call comes in, and what happens? The music fades out, you take your call. As soon as you're done, you click end, and the music fades back in. Now, on the one hand, this is not rocket science, right? This is nothing that should be terribly complicated in terms of how it's put together. All it simply means is that the 2 teams, the team that built the phone app and the team that built the music app, were able to communicate with each other. But more importantly, they thought about the experience of using the 2 things together, right? It wasn't enough to have a good phone app or enough to have a good music app if they didn't work together, if one clunked off when the other one clinked on, and then they didn't pick back up. That's a poor experience. Now, the fact of the matter is that in the consumer industry, we've come to expect these kinds of experience. Apple and lots of other companies have begun to push the boundaries of thinking about, all right, what is the experience of using all of these individual pieces, all these individual tools and services and apps together? Unfortunately, the developer experience has not kept pace. And, we have seen efforts over time to try to address this. One of the earliest in the market was a company called Heroku. Many of you probably know them. And it's a company that was, sort of early on, sort of focused on that developer experience. They took a bunch of different pieces in terms of the version control Git, which they use for deployment, Ruby and Rails for the runtime initially, and they had databases, of course, sort of Postgres and so on. But what they tried to do more importantly was try to take a bunch of these individual pieces and put them together to deliver a higher quality experience, much in the way that we would, sort of think about on the iPhone, with a music app and a phone app that work together. The problem with Heroku was that it was too constrained and too limiting for many developers. They had lots of other complaints. It didn't scale, or it was too expensive for what they wanted. So that vision really never caught on. And it has not come to define the industry standard experience that we might expect, today, sort of all these years later. So instead, the world as we see it today is, what we at Redmonk like to joke about as a Scrooge McDuck embarrassment of riches. And what we mean by that is that, in comparison to the developer world 5 years ago, 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, it's a sort of night and different environment, right? In the sense that, we have literally a project, a library, a service, an API, possibly even a managed service for almost everything you could possibly want to do. And, this is in stark contrast to the world that, certainly that I came up in, and a lot of you probably listening to this did as well, in which, a lot of the things you needed to do by hand. It's great. In many respects, there has never been a better time to be a developer, right? That you have all of this huge array of resources at your disposal. But there's a cost to this. And the cost ultimately is that this all comes with overhead, right? And there's a bunch of different forms that overhead can take. Now, you can't see this, probably in the slides as I'm presenting them to you, but it's a GIF. And the GIF is of a 80s TV show called the ATeam. Now, most of you are either probably too young or maybe you didn't, grow up in the U.S., so you're not familiar with the ATeam. But the gist of it was that every episode on this TV show, for reasons that are still unexplained to this day, they had a montage scene. And during the montage scene, the ATeam would have to build something. And they'd have to build it basically MacGyver style out of parts that were laying around. Right? So they pick up some sheets of cast iron, some corrugated aluminum, a bunch of nails and screws, some wire, some pipe, and they would build something. Right? In this case, I can't remember. I think it's a tank. But the bad here is that this is effectively what we're asking developers like yourselves to do. Right? This is the world that you live in every day, in the sense that you have to go out and pick up all these raw materials, and you have to weld them together, you have to screw them together, you have to fasten them together, and worse, not only have you had to select and assemble them, in many cases you're asked to operate them, yourself, sort of moving forward. All of which takes time away from, what you should be doing, and maybe what you want to do, which is, sort of building things that are, hopefully more important to you than, essentially welding together sort of piece parts. So this is ultimately what we call the developer experience gap. This is the problem. And, on the one hand, as we talked about, there's never been a better time to be a developer, a DBA, whomever, because you have this huge array of assets at your disposal, libraries, APIs, managed services, and so on. But there's all these gaps in between them, right? We have all these individual services that then need to be, we need to have those gaps taken out. And what we hear from developers over and over and over again is that this is a major issue in their day every day. And it is, if anything, it's only getting worse. And ironically, it's only getting worse for the company that is perhaps the best evidence of why this is important, right? So this is a quote from Andy Jassy. Andy Jassy was at the time of this quote in 2018, the head of AWS, and is now the head of Amazon. And basically, the gist of the quote, as you can read here, is that it is a statement, implicit or otherwise, of the utter importance of developers to Amazon's success. So Amazon's success in the marketplace, and it's obviously a sort of major vendor, has been driven in large part by individual developers and other practitioners like yourself. And so on the one hand, Amazon is perhaps one of the best examples in the industry of the importance of developers and why they are driving the industry to where we're going today. But on the flip side, they're sort of exhibit A of the problem, right? Which is they are rolling out service after service after service after service. And what we are hearing from developers, and maybe many of you are experiencing today, is they just can't keep up. And it's a case of diminishing returns. We have a case where, what am I supposed to do with all of these new services that are coming out faster than I can learn them, faster than I can absorb them, faster than I can integrate them, let alone, sort of deal with the problem of operation. So this is, again, sort of the sort of pro, case for why developers are important, and the con case in terms of, how developers are struggling today. Now, one of the questions we get asked by enterprises all the time is, okay, so what? Like, why do I care about this? Like, so developers' lives are more difficult. in the abstract, sure, I would prefer that not the case, but what does that mean to me? What does that mean to my business? And more particularly, if you're a developer, what are you going to tell, your boss or your boss's boss in terms of why it's important? And why addressing this developer experience gap is something you need to do. Well, the answer to that is ultimately speed, right? It's just that simple. The conversation that we have with enterprises, all of them, is the same for the first time in years as the conversation we now have with the practitioners themselves, which is they want to move more quickly. They want to move faster. They want to put the pedal to the metal. And the benefit of targeting and improving your developer experience is that your developers go faster, and as a result, you go faster. Because the less time your developers are spending picking parts out, pulling them together, welding them, duct taping them, is more time that they're spending writing actual code, right? And this is why it matters. So fine, okay. So we have the developer experience. We have sort of an explanation as to why it's important. Now, what does that look like? How do we improve that? Well, there's a couple characteristics to approaches that we think are important in terms of addressing this gap and closing it, and ideally delivering a better experience to you. And sort of exhibit A of this is that it needs to be comprehensive, right? It needs to be sort of a broadly functional solution with a bunch of different sort of component parts. Now, this is true whether it's native and integrated all first party, or whether it's composed of a bunch of different sort of individual solutions and projects. It has to be comprehensively functional. Otherwise, basically what we're talking about is the old world, right? Which is, kind of a Unix philosophy. Hey, I have I have one tool that does one thing very well, and I have to chain them together in different ways. And that worked great to a point, but we're well past that point. We're to a point where there's too many of these tools. We can't string them together and operate them effectively. Therefore, the solutions to this developer experience gap need to be comprehensive. Likewise, they need to be developer native. The backdrop to this particular slide is a tool called MARP. MARP, if you haven't seen it, is essentially it's a framework. It's a piece of software that will allow you to write your slides, PowerPoint, PDF, whatever, in Markdown in the context of Visual Studio Code. So you get the developer native point here, right? Which is that, there are a lot of solutions which are, hey, I will do this for you if you come and use my interface, if you come and use a totally different, CLI, a totally different approach to management, what have you. The tools that are going to be so successful longer term are going to be those that integrate back into the developer toolchain, right? And they're going to integrate back into things that are developer native, right? Things like Visual Studio Code. Likewise, the solutions ideally are going to be elegant, right? There is the backdrop for this is I believe the car is a Bugatti Atlantic. I'm not much of a car person, but if you Google elegant, this is one of the first things that comes up, and it certainly seems to be. And this is sort of an underappreciated aspect, to developer experience solutions, which is not just, oh, hey, there's an API, it's kind of clunky, but it should work. It'll integrate. Does it do so elegantly? Like, going back to the iPhone example, does the music fade out? Does the music fade back in? Have people sat down and thought about how these individual functions work together side by side? Or were they just checking a box that said, yes, I have this functionality, I have this functionality? The integration of these, and more importantly, the aesthetics of that integration matter. Likewise, this is probably not a terribly controversial statement at this point. It has to be multi-run time. There was a time many years ago when, databases or other pieces of software could come out and say, hey, I'll support .NET and I'll support Java, and that's enough. Those days have been gone for a long time. The backdrop to this particular slide is a plot that we run twice a year, ranking programming languages. And, it'll be an eye chart. Of course, you're not meant to sort of appreciate, the exact placement here as much as it is, there are 100 different languages on here, and there are probably 40 to 45 on any given run that are relevant and showing significant usage. So the reality for most enterprises, and certainly most developers, is that you're going to be using more than one runtime and more than one language. And therefore, whatever your, sort of approach and solution to, the developer experience gap is going to be, it should be multi-runtime. Likewise, it has to be multi-vendor. The backdrop here is the CNCF, the famed CNCF landscape chart, which is even more of an eye chart, than our language plot. And, the lesson here is very simple, right? Which is the fact that there is no one vendor, no matter how large, no matter how capable, that is going to deliver every last piece of technology that someone needs. It's impossible to do. And therefore, what we're looking at are solutions, developer solutions that are going to incorporate multiple vendors. And therefore, you have to think about the experience of what it's like using tools from multiple vendors in conjunction and in concert with one another. And then lastly, we're looking at multi-data models, right? So it's not enough these days to just think about, a world in which, hey, 5 or 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, a relational database was it, right? If we're talking about databases, it was, hey, the answer is a relational database. Now, what's the question? And it's not the world anymore. It hasn't been the world since about 2009, as we'll talk about. But whatever your solution to the developer experience gap is, you're going to need to think about, pieces like, how am I going to handle JSON documents? How am I going to handle search, right? On top of all the other individual pieces that we're talking about. You need to have the flexibility as a data platform to address multiple models to ensure a seamless experience. Because again, the alternative is, if you're not doing that, a developer or DBA or whomever is going to have to go out and basically source individual components to solve each one of these needs, integrate them all, and operate them all, and back them up and protect them and so on. And that's not sort of the fundamental experience that you're going to want longer term. So where are we today? Or where are we, where were we 5 or 10 years ago? Where are we going? So let's start with where we were. So 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, right? The world was, in many respects, much, much simpler. We had a much more limited toolkit. As you can see from this particular picture, to stick with this metaphor, a lot of hand tools. There wasn't a lot of automation. There wasn't a lot of managed services. It was not, certainly the world that we enjoy today. And, this was the world of the general purpose database is the answer to every last possible question. And, this was great for building certain classes of applications, but it began to fall down, right? And particularly once we hit, sort of the true scale of the internet age, and we began having to construct distributed applications spread out across, hundreds, if not thousands or hundreds of thousands of machines, the simple tools that we were used to were no longer the ones that we needed. So this ushered in an age of, the age that we're still living in, right? And from this era of simple hand tools, we have graduated into a world of big box stores. So for those of you, who may be from geographies and you're not familiar with this is a picture of Lowe's, I believe. Basically, we have a bunch of these in the United States where it's a giant, giant warehouse, sort of aisles as far as you can see. And the aisles are stocked with, thousands and thousands and thousands of different tools. And, as we talked about at the top, this on the one hand is an excellent thing from a developer standpoint, because no longer do you have to try to, sort of go out and build something like a house with the metaphorical equivalent of an axe, a handsaw, and a hammer. You can go out and get, framing guns. You can go out and get circular saws. You can go out and get, these automated tools, which are much more powerful. But, the flip side is that this comes with a significant cost. And that cost is ultimately, I have to go through, this store, select all these individual pieces, pick them out, figure out how to use them together. And in the majority of cases, again, as we've discussed, nobody has sat down and thought about, well, how do these things work with each other, right? People have thought about, all right, how do I build the best, sort of framing nailer and the best table saw or skill saw or whatever, but they haven't thought about, all right, what's the workflow like? What's the process of using these together? And this, for better or for worse, is the world that we live in today. It's a world characterized by thousands and thousands of primitives that developers are being asked and tasked with evaluating, selecting, integrating, operating, and just managing on an ongoing basis. And it's just not sustainable. So where we're going. So it was interesting this fall, after a number of different conferences and sort of announcements and events and so on. We've begun to hear this probably 6 to 12 months ago, but it really picked up this past fall, which is we're beginning to see this sort of appetite, this desire, this explicitly stated request from some of the higher profile developers that we follow in the industry, which is looking for an alternative, which is looking for something other than, hey, I'm going to go out and pick all these individual primitives myself. I'm going to try to put them together myself. And, I'm going to assemble this essentially Rube Goldberg, patchwork quilt infrastructure. And, that's going to be the answer. And you see this particularly in the database world, right? Where there is this real frustration with, all right, I have one database for this data type, another database for this data type, another database for this data type, and I'm going to use them all in the same application and manage them separately and manage them distinctly. So what we have seen ultimately, in this industry is a shift away from the general purpose database to specialized databases, and now we're beginning to see a return. So as I said sort of earlier in this presentation, what the world that we came from was dominated by the relational database. The relational database was everything. It was all the things that we were seeing, sort of in the market from a database standpoint. If somebody asked you about a database, they were talking about a relational database. Around about 2008 or 2009, that began to shift. The term NoSQL itself, I believe, was coined in 2009. And that ushered in an era of specialized databases. So no longer was it just relational databases we were talking about, although they enjoyed and still enjoy to this day a prominent position. But all of a sudden we had databases specialized on JSON documents. We had databases that specialized on search. We had databases that specialized on graph, and on and on and on. Key value, you name it. And this was necessary because of the shortcomings both of the relational database model in many cases, but also because a lot of the relational databases weren't built from the ground up to take advantage of distributed computing environments. So we needed a new class of software, and we got it. The unfortunate cost to that was that it introduced overhead. It introduced a sort of complexity in terms of the use, because if you want to use two or more different data models on a given application, you're dealing with two or more different databases, which is more integrations, which is more sort of cognitive overhead for the developer to deal with. And it offers a poor experience, which is why we are now seeing sort of a shift back towards the general purpose database platform. We're seeing a shift back towards a model in which developers are asking their data platforms to handle more types of data, right? So they want the ability to deal with documents. They want the ability to deal with graph. They want the ability to deal with in-memory. They want the ability to deal with search in one platform. And this is the shift we're seeing in the market. With that, I am Stephen O'Grady. I'm the co-founder of Redmonk. Appreciate the invite to be here today. If any of you have any questions on any of the above, developer experience, general purpose databases, specialized databases, what have you, or open source databases for that matter, not terribly difficult to find online. And with that, I'll just say thanks.
Thanks, Steve. The DBMS market is exploding, and it's fascinating to see the effects of the database unbundling on the developer experience. We're aiming for the right balance with Redis Stack by bringing the data models together that are in highest demand by the developers. We believe the light bundling approach provides the best developer experience without sacrificing power and flexibility.